point out to the medicine folks in the room is that you'll see some extra people, some strange faces, and also a camera here. And the goal of that is not to make me nervous so much as to highlight the fact that this is a part of our ongoing lecture series, the Hot Topics in Global Health. And so today we're lucky enough to have Dr. Bert Topknot here, who is a research fellow at the Hoover Institute. He also teaches history and international relations at Stanford, and then is involved in the medical center lecturing via the Department of Pediatrics in the Center for Biomedical Ethics. And so he has, after getting transplanted from the East Coast, has like a long course at Stanford. I think it's 20 plus years at this point.
Yes, exactly.
With topics kind of dominated by Russian history and how that plays into international relations. What you guys will note and how this ties into global health is that over the years, Dr. Topknot has developed an interest in humanitarianism, particularly food aid programs and things like that, especially as how it pertains to Russian history. And I think that we're going to hear more about that today. I very much look forward to it, and I hope you guys can help me welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Great to be here. I hope I'm not going to ruin your lunch with what I'm going to tell you today. Some of you know some of the stuff. Let me start on an upbeat note. Perhaps some of you read the New York Times. You saw Nicholas Kristof's column on Sunday. I hope you saw it. Advice on how to choose the perfect holiday gift. This is relevant, as you'll see in a minute. Kristof advises that if you want to give in a meaningful way, one option is to donate $30 to the International Rescue Committee in order to buy a flock of chickens for a needy family. At CARE, $29 gets a girl a school uniform, as he says. Through Heifer International, you can stock a fish pond for $300. And through Mercy Corps, $69 can start a female entrepreneurship in the sewing business. That's the first paragraph of the Nick Kristof column on Sunday. And really, this is the new frontier of humanitarianism, but you wouldn't know it from reading any of Nicholas Kristof's columns. I'm a fan of his, but you wouldn't know it from reading his columns, that humanitarianism is really under siege right now. It has been so for about the past 15 years. The humanitarian aid industry is accused of waste, fraud, graft, even of facilitating conflicts. There have been a series of books and articles over the past 15 years or so which have subjected humanitarian aid and the humanitarian movement, as it's called, to intense criticism. Now, interestingly, most of that criticism comes from the political left, the left wing. You would expect it to come, of course, from conservatives, from right-wingers. It comes from the left. And the best books come from really the best informed people who have seen these crises that I'm going to talk to you about today up front. These are former humanitarians. The book titles give it away. One I didn't bring today, but which sort of got the ball rolling back in 1997. The author is Michael Marin, and the book, he called his book The Road to Hell. You know what that's supposed to be paved with, although Michael Marin does not assume that the road is necessarily paved with good intentions. Reading his book, you see that he regards humanitarians as a new breed of mercenaries. He's very hard on them. Soldiers of misfortune, he calls them. So today, what I'm going to do is sketch in the history of humanitarian relief, explain how we got here. We can't do everything. I certainly can't do everything in 40 minutes. So what I'm going to do is focus on humanitarian responses to armed conflict or to humanitarian crises with a political dimension. I'll have a little bit to say about disaster relief and peacetime economic development, but again, we can't do everything in 1 hour. Humanitarianism, or the humanitarian movement, as it's called, really came into being at the time of the famine in Biafra. That was 1968. The year before, oil-rich Biafra had seceded from Nigeria, not Nicaragua, from Nigeria. And in response to that, Nigeria had attacked and laid siege to Biafra. foreign correspondents on the scene spotted the first sign of a famine in the spring of 1968. And by the summer, the reports coming out of Biafra talked about thousands of the very youngest Biafrans dying every day. Photographers made their way there. Television crews made their way there. This was, the civil war in Nigeria, was the first African war to be televised. And suddenly, the Biafra famine was really one of the great stories of the era. Turn on the TV in '68, and there were horrific scenes. Children with skeletal limbs, swollen bellies, wizened faces. Those kids were on the evening news as often as American soldiers in the battlefields of Vietnam. Few people had seen such images since the Nazi death camps. And the ties to, the connection to, the emotional ties to the Holocaust came through in all of this reporting in 1968. There were meetings, protests. Remember, this is 1968, shoulder-length hair on the guys, right? This is time of the great idealism still. There were demonstrations of various kinds. And if you, for example, were in school and maybe complained about the quality of the food, what would you hear in response? I heard it at home all the time. Think of the children in Biafra. And that would shut you up, or it was supposed to shut you up. Now, in Biafra, who was on the scene? It was the International Committee of the Red Cross. In 1967, the ICRC, from here on out we're just going to call it the Red Cross, which was the world's oldest and largest humanitarian non-governmental organization. 1967, its total budget, annual budget, was $500,000. A year later, the Red Cross was spending in Biafra alone about $1.5 million a month. And there were other NGOs, non-governmental organizations, on the scene as well. Their budgets were growing exponentially as well. The interesting thing one of the interesting things was that Biafra was inaccessible except by air. And so in the fall of 1968, a humanitarian airlift began, known as the Biafran Air Bridge, independent of any state support. It was carried out entirely by NGOs. All the flying had to be done at night because the planes were under constant fire from the Nigerian military. At its peak, in 1969, this airlift was delivering an average of 250 metric tons of food a night. There had been nothing like it since the Berlin airlift, and that's what it was very often compared to on the evening news back in 1968-69. It was a success so far, from what I've told you, but the moral assessment of the Biafra situation, the Biafra operation, is filled with ambiguity still today. Biafra's secessionist leaders, secessionist government, hired a Swiss public relations firm and had a very formidable propaganda department. It was they who began to wave the banner of genocide, to cry genocide, before any of the reporters on the scene began to use the word. And yet, the secessionist government, when it was finally forced to surrender and rejoin Nigeria, which happened in 1970, the predicted genocide that had been talked about for a couple of years, those massacres, never materialized. It soon became apparent, and here's the controversy, that had it not been for the West's charity, the Nigerian civil war would have ended much sooner than had been predicted, and more lives would have been saved. Lives were saved by the airlift for sure, but you had to now weigh that against all the lives that were taken by the prolongation, continuation of the war because of the airlift. How many lives? At least tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands. Some of the credible reports I see, 180,000 additional lives lost at the time. Now, the Red Cross ultimately withdrew from this scene, from the Nigerian Civil War, because it was concerned about preserving its neutrality. Now, why is neutrality important to the Red Cross? Because actually the Red Cross by law is designated as the neutral provider of medical assistance under the Geneva Convention. The Red Cross, founded in 1863 in Geneva, Switzerland, by a Swiss businessman by the name of Henri Dunant. Henri Dunant won the first Nobel Peace Prize, by the way, in 1901. Dunant had seen the horrors of war up close in Italy, and he was inspired to create a standing, sort of professionalized service for the provision of humanitarian relief, first and foremost for soldiers, wounded soldiers, soldiers on the battlefield. He founded the Red Cross, Dunant did, on 3 bedrock principles, which we'll keep coming back to today: impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Now, also important, Dunant was instrumental in establishing simultaneously the Geneva Convention, signed by 12 European nations. The Geneva Convention, which has been supplemented over the years, delineated what was lawful and unlawful in times of war, and it also created the International Committee of the Red Cross, a neutral band of volunteer medical staff who had the right, the sole right, exclusive right, to enter the battlefield and to assist the wounded. By the way, not by accident. The flag of the Red Cross is the Swiss flag inverted. Red Cross on a white background is the Swiss flag inverted. This is very much a Swiss organization. So the ICRC, or the Red Cross, is committed to neutrality, impartiality, and independence, but it's striving to maintain those standards that led to the dark chapter in the Red Cross's history. And that came during World War II, when the Red Cross workers in Germany knew about the Nazi gas chambers but remained silent. It turned out that neutrality and impartiality in the face of atrocity could be indistinguishable from complicity. The ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, was trapped. It was caught. It feared that if it blew the whistle on the Holocaust, then the German government would kick it out. It would no longer allow it to administer relief. So it kept silent. Today, everyone recognizes this as a tragic mistake. Now, fast forward back to Biafra, 1968, the Red Cross found itself confronted with the same dilemma. Should it observe neutrality, or should it blow the whistle on what it thought was an unfolding genocide? In fact, the Red Cross refused to compromise its neutrality, refused to go public, despite those reports, which turned out to be exaggerated, the reports that the Nigerian federal government was really attempting a kind of genocide by starvation on the Biafran rebels in the southeastern part of the country. At the time, here's where all of you come in. At the time, the Red Cross was shorthanded because this was a big operation. Its budget was coming up. So it was forced to recruit outside doctors to help out. Many of them were young Frenchmen, some of them barely out of medical school. In fact, some of them were still medical students. Eventually, some of them were so troubled by what they saw happening in Nigeria, Biafra, that they broke publicly with the Red Cross. They believed they were witnessing another genocide. In 1971, these doctors went on to form Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, to use the French original, Doctors Without Borders, MSF, as we'll call it today. This, of course, as you know, and because you know it, the evidence is there that it went on to become one of the most important and influential NGOs in the world. Its medical protocols are still the model for other relief organizations. It's envied, it's resented by the other groups, it's pretty arrogant, but some people feel that it has the right to be because it's so effective at what it does. Really, in the books, all the books you read, including the books that I'll be talking about in a moment that have really talked about the humanitarian movement as being tainted and as being flawed, MSF comes across as really standing above the fray. It's really the conscience of the humanitarian world, the ultimate nonconformist or contrarian aid agency. Unlike the Red Cross, this new group, MSF, made testimony, very important word, testimony, part of its mission. Soigner et témoigner is the slogan. Heal or care for and bear witness. Both those go hand in hand. The basic idea of MSF is that observing neutrality at a time of what in aid speak is called complex emergency can lead to collaboration in crimes. You have to observe the Hippocratic principle, do no harm. You have to keep that firmly in mind, something the Red Cross, they felt, wasn't doing. Well, the MSF, Doctors Without Borders, was in fact there to bear witness a decade later, decade and a half later, in the 1980s, when famine broke out, large-scale famine, in Ethiopia. The same complications about neutrality arose, the same complicated questions as Western humanitarian aid was flown into Ethiopia. Again, we had the televised images of starving children, horrific stuff. And the world again was stirred into action, including some rock stars. As you may know, that gets their attention. I saw all the heads go up, right? Band-Aid. You're too young to remember this. Band-Aid, Bob Geldof. If you Google him, you'll find a lot about Ethiopia. They got together in London and released a single, Do They Know It's Christmas? You'll probably hear it if you listen to Christmas songs on FM radio this holiday season. No doubt you'll run into it. This single and the Live Aid concerts in July 1985 raised over £50 million for Ethiopian famine relief. No one knows how many people died in the Ethiopian famine of the mid-'80s. The estimates run, typically, it's very hard to determine these things. The estimates run from 300,000 as the low figure to as many as 1 million. The Ethiopian famine of the mid-'80s was Oxfam's moment. Oxfam had been founded in 1942. The acronym stands for Oxford Committee for Famine Relief. And Oxfam steps forward. It's Oxfam and Band-Aid who are sort of the face of humanitarian relief in the mid-1980s. For them, as they look at the problem, there is no political dimension to the famine. The famine is the result of an affliction, age-old poverty, a drought, a force of nature. Human beings have nothing to do with it. So if you look at the rhetoric of Live Aid in 1985, it's indistinguishable from the rhetoric of the tsunami relief in 2004. But the tsunami of 2004 was an authentic natural disaster. Ethiopia in 1985 was in fact very different. There was a drought, but as important, even perhaps more important, the Addis Ababa government had two projects going on which guaranteed that there would be a famine. One was a forced resettlement program involving 600,000 people. And the second thing was a forced agricultural collectivization program involving about 3 million people. The charge, and it won't go away despite what Bob Geldof says, the charge is that Western aid turned out to be complicit in those crimes, even if unwittingly, and even if it ended up saving lives. To be sure, Live Aid achieved much. And one expert, Alex de Waal, a Dutchman who knows Ethiopia and sort of an expert on Africa, says the relief from Live Aid, from Oxfam, may have cut the death toll by between 1/4 and 1/2. The problem, as de Waal himself says, is that it also may have contributed to the number of deaths by facilitating the Ethiopian government's totalitarian projects. That's the dilemma here. In fact, some go so far as to say that the general picture that we saw of the dire situation in Ethiopia, the sort of extent of the famine, was to some degree manipulated by the Addis Ababa government. When confronted with this, and the United States government was very much on top of this, the NGOs, Oxfam in particular, and the UN specialized agencies on the scene, more about them in a moment, they took the position that their only option was to stay. MSF took a look at the situation, and I now mean MSF's founding French office, right? Founding French section. There are 19 sections of MSF now around the world, but the French section pulled out. It disagreed with the consensus, and it decided that Ethiopia was no place for humanitarian aid agencies. Now, key point before we leap into the 90s, this was not a major controversy at the time. Certainly not outside of aid circles. The larger public really didn't know a lot about this. They were unaware of it. That would change because the nature of humanitarian aid was about to change. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. The Cold War ends, right? The Soviet Union collapses in 1991. This proved to be something that wasn't predicted, a major turning point for humanitarianism. The Cold War stalemate had really kept humanitarian intervention in check. Why? Because we didn't want to blow each other up. So in the name of preserving peace, you just didn't interfere in one or another's sphere of influence. So the big disasters that we see, humanitarian disasters, the famines in Africa, were exceptional cases. But then, when the USSR collapses, the nature of armed conflict changes, and with it the position of aid organizations. From now on, starting 1991-92, it's the local warring parties, factions, governments, whatever, who decide when and on what condition organizations can be given access to victims. By the early 90s, the world was witnessing a proliferation of aid groups. And the ones that already were in place were growing enormously. Just one figure I'll give you. 1982, there were 144 humanitarian aid agencies registered with USAID, meaning United States Agency for International Development. So in 1982, 144 registered. 12 years later, the number had grown to 419. Funding for their operations also grew precipitously. Most of that money comes from governments and the United Nations, but the United Nations is getting the money from governments. And when I say United Nations, I mean organizations like the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, WHO, the World Health Organization, and UNICEF. The donors for those organizations are primarily really the rich governments, the Western governments. Now, this expansion of the NGOs and their activities was fed by responses to emergencies in Bosnia, Somalia, Rwanda, those three in the first half of the 1990s, Bosnia, Somalia, and Rwanda. Let me sketch them in briefly. Briefly is all we have time for, but let me sketch those in and build up what is the indictment of the books by the critics of humanitarianism. Somalia first. In the early 90s, summer of 1992, we get reports of famine out of Somalia, and the UN sets up a relief operation. It fails miserably. By the end of the year, we're getting word that there's going to be another Ethiopia, right? Another Biafra, this time in Somalia. So in December, the United States, President George Bush, first Bush, Herbert Walker Bush, and his government step in and send in the Marines who deliver humanitarian relief, Operation Restore Hope, and it did. In fact, the famine was dealt with in a matter of months. So what's the problem? Well, in his book, The Road to Hell, Michael Marin describes, the chapter is called Creating Dependency, how food aid to Somalia in the 80s actually helped set up the famine. The catalyst in Marin's chapter is the former president who proved to be very skillful at using food aid to undermine his clan rivals and really, in effect, to destroy small-scale agriculture, which is replaced with export-oriented plantations run by his cronies. Marin writes, and I quote, "Food aid transformed Somalia from a self-sufficient exporter of food to an aid-dependent kleptocracy." So that's the first charge about Somalia. Humanitarianism helped cause the famine. The second charge is that the death toll in Somalia was exaggerated. And in fact, by the time the intervention, the U.S. intervention was underway in the winter of 1992-93, the mortality rate from famine and disease really was already declining. Despite the fact that the famine is fading, the U.S. Goes in and we have intervention forces, the Marines storm the shores, Mogadishu is occupied, and there's widespread international acclaim. Of course, here's a footnote. You know that this will end badly for the United States and the United Nations. Once the famine is defeated, the UN and the U.S. become drawn into a nation building. It was a term that was not a term, a pejorative term at the time. It was a very positive term. Nation building mission in Somalia, but they failed to back it up with sufficient force, committing sufficient force or funds, and that would lead in October of 1993 to the fiasco we know as Black Hawk Down in Mogadishu. The firefight in early October 1993, 2 Black Hawks went down. Actually, 18 U.S. Army Rangers perished. That's not the humanitarians' fault. That's not part of the indictment, but I wanted to make sure you knew how that ended. Meanwhile, number 2, Bosnia. There, 1992-93, a civil war and genocide begin to unfold. After Yugoslavia begins to break up into a kind of 3-cornered contest, Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, and humanitarian aid agencies become involved in a major way, but not in an entirely helpful way, according to the critics. In fact, what happens is that Western European governments in particular don't want to take Bosnian refugees in if they can avoid it. And so they come up with the idea, in order to get them to stay in their place, that humanitarian action will do the trick. Humanitarianism, in other words, gives the great powers an excuse to do nothing, simply to contain the crisis, not to resolve the crisis. What they could have done, should have done, as most critics say, is credible threat of military force that would have gotten the Serbs to back down. But instead, the Western powers decided to opt for a massive humanitarian effort, and again, merely to contain the crisis, not to resolve it. When I say massive, by 1995, there were 250 NGOs in the Balkans. 1995 is when the conflict really winds to an end. The most important entity on the scene was the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Now, that should be surprising to you, because these weren't refugees we're talking about. Remember, the food and medical supplies came in to keep them in place, to keep them from becoming refugees. Under the pressure of events, though, the UNHCR really underwent an extraordinary transformation, and in a matter of months became the world's largest relief agency. It accomplished an enormous amount, delivering extraordinary amount of food and medical supplies, the Sarajevo airlift, as it was called. Eventually, about 10,000 people were killed in Sarajevo, 3,000 of them children. But the UNHCR operation is regarded as a success. By mid-1993, the UNHCR was spending about $1 million a day to get aid to more than 2.7 million people in Bosnia. Bosnia's total population before the war was 4.5 million, so that's a lot. So by the end of the Bosnian War, the UNHCR was really the humanitarian monopoly player in Bosnia. So was this good, or was this right? The answer of the critics is no way. The UNHCR should have supported its traditional role of guardian of refugee rights. Instead, its actions were designed to prevent people from becoming refugees in the first place. In other words, the UNHCR did the work of the Western countries that really wanted no more asylum seekers. And the question is asked, Why should the UNHCR, which is a refugee agency, be responsible for the citizens of the Bosnian capital, Sarajevo? They weren't refugees. The fact is, as we see it now, and I think few people would disagree with this, the more that the UNHCR and the NGOs did in Bosnia, the more political cover they provided to the great powers to do nothing and to put a stop to the slaughter. Bosnia really demonstrated, that was some commentators call it the Waterloo of the humanitarian movement. Bosnia demonstrated that humanitarianism really couldn't operate in a vacuum without political engagement. That was Bosnia. Rwanda would establish this point really without any doubt. Rwanda, of course, is the genocide of the spring of 1994. Hutu government-inspired genocide massacres on an enormous scale. Over 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus are slaughtered within 9 weeks. Most people, or rather more people, died in less time than in any other massacre in modern history. The humanitarian dimension comes in only afterwards, and very controversially. In Rwanda in 1994, as the Tutsi minority fought back, gained control of the country, more than 1 million refugees, Hutus, crossed the border into eastern Zaire, what we call Congo today. They did so in about 24 hours, more than 1 million. It was the night of July 14, 15, quite extraordinary. In all, by the end of that summer, there were 2 million Hutu refugees in eastern Congo. That becomes the scene of a series of vast refugee camps, hastily set up by the UNHCR, cholera, dysentery, other infectious diseases rampant. It's a real mess. A heroic effort ensues. Various UN agencies, private relief organizations, NGOs, and the American and French military, and they managed to come in at a cost of $1.3 billion and blunt the epidemics. It should be a success story. But who was living in those camps? Who were the beneficiaries? In fact, the refugee camps were filled with armed Hutu fighters. And the aid workers, of course, were in no position to disarm them. And in fact, what relief could get through really depended on the acquiescence of the gunmen. Many of the gunmen had willingly participated in the genocide in the spring of 1994. This was awkward, to say the least, right? But what was a disaster for the refugees turned out to be an opportunity for the Western powers. They had stood by in 1994 when this genocide unfolded in fast motion, as they say. They didn't do anything. Now they could do something. They could at least appear to be doing something and assuage their guilt for having let the genocide unfold unimpeded. So the Western powers were very eager to fund the relief operations, a kind of stopgap, fallback position. But the reality was this aid allowed those who were loyal to the old regime to survive, to regroup, and to start to launch guerrilla attacks rather, from the refugee camps into Rwanda. Eventually, by 1996, the Tutsi government in Rwanda, by the way, which got virtually no humanitarian aid, the victims, right, no humanitarian aid through this whole period, the Rwandan Tutsi government eventually invaded Congo, destroyed the camps, forced most of the refugees back into Rwanda. Those who tried to flee were hunted down. Tens of thousands were killed. Massacres reported. That all came in 1996. But for that period, 1994-95, it was a very unhappy situation for the humanitarians. They were helpless, really, to stop the genocidal regime from really kind of reasserting itself in the camps. They couldn't separate the innocent from the killers. And in effect, they become the kind of medics of those who committed mass murder. Relief supplies stolen, sold in the markets. It would break your heart. I could go on and on about that. A lot's been written, including the very good book by Philip Gourevitch, which I think some of you must know. A number of agencies Notably, you'll get tired of hearing me say this, the French branch of Doctors Without Borders, as well as the International Rescue Committee, withdrew in 1995. They believed this was a dead end, a bad idea. But now this is important. This was really a symbolic gesture, and they knew it. Why? Because as soon as they got out, there were other agencies, including other branches of Doctors Without Borders, who were very eager to fill the vacancy left by any departing NGOs. This was the moment when you saw convincing proof that, in fact, delivering humanitarian aid had become a kind of business. The relief workers themselves referred to the scene in the camps at this time as a humanitarian circus. More than 100 private aid agencies turned up in the Congo camps. The cynical view is to cash in on the emergency. They clearly went there doing promotion for themselves, wearing stickers, brandishing flags. Why? Because they needed to be seen by those television cameras that would transmit the images to the folks back home. There was bad-mouthing of the work of competing charities. A lot of that went on. They felt that they had to be there or die, was the phrase that was used. Be there or die. In other words, you're never going to get funding unless you're seen on the scene of this great catastrophe. And also they set up high-profile projects that really were inappropriate, duplicated each other's work. Again, I could break your heart and go into that in more detail. That's why we hear that the mid-90s really was the great reckoning for the humanitarian movement. A real debate, not just on the outside, but inside the movement about the ethical dilemmas of mixing humanitarianism and politics. It gets worse. In 1999, there was a war in Kosovo, and that took things one step further and led to more questions and soul-searching. Kosovo, you may know, it's now an independent country, was a province of Serbia, actually the old Yugoslavia, and its Muslim population was facing repression from the Belgrade Serbian government. That led to spring of 1999, actually in March, a NATO attack from the air. The first so-called humanitarian war to go by that name. Why would NATO attack Serbia? It believed that there was an incipient genocide unfolding. But in fact, now 1999 gets pretty close to your dates, right? You remember, you watched some of this, I think. NATO's air attack helped create an enormous humanitarian emergency. NATO intended a police action, sort of strategic bombing, limited bombing, to force President Milosevic to come to the peace table, but it turned into a fiasco. It made a bad situation appallingly worse. NATO's bombing begins, and within days, hundreds of thousands of Kosovars are fleeing their province, what they regard as their country, to the south. They are ending up in Albania and Macedonia, hundreds of thousands, to the point where it was 800,000 Kosovars who exited the country. So all of a sudden, the humanitarian element that was supposed to be only a small part of the political crisis in Kosovo became just about the main event. It became at least a vital element here. NATO suddenly found itself in the humanitarian business, not the way it did in Bosnia in delegating to the UN, but it took control. NATO troops occupied the so-called humanitarian space, flying in tents, setting up camps to shelter refugees. Why? Because the NGOs were overwhelmed. They couldn't have done it. It was an emergency. NATO's military engineers had the logistical capability to respond, and they did. Now, the crisis in this for the humanitarian movement was that NATO was setting the humanitarian agenda. What some found troubling was not just that soldiers were performing the functions that were once reserved for aid workers, and that aid workers were taking orders from soldiers, unheard of. It was also the use of the word humanitarian to justify a war, and even again that phrase, humanitarian war. It made some humanitarian relief workers feel queasy. This, remember, was supposed to be about impartiality, delivering assistance to populations in a neutral fashion, and here we are justifying airstrikes. In fact, urging them on. But for all of those humanitarians who were uncomfortable with this notion, there are many more who thought, yes, this is the only way to go. They had seen earlier in 1998 how the Serbs were treating the Kosovars in the Kosovar villages, and they had really come to the conclusion that delivering humanitarian relief the usual way was a dead end. It was actually just perpetuating the problem and really giving these people more punishment to endure. What you needed, the only solution, was war, to defeat the Serb forces, drive them out of Kosovo, and it made them uneasy. But the idea was you needed to abandon any pretext of neutrality or impartiality. By 1999, the rhetoric of humanitarian military intervention had blurred a certain distinction, which you may not have thought about up until now. I run into this problem all the time with my undergraduates. The distinction between humanitarianism on the one hand and human rights on the other. Those are two distinct things, or they used to be, right? But people want to talk to you about human rights and they end up asking you about humanitarianism, and then you realize that they just don't get it. But the blurring begins at this time. What aid groups mean when they talk about human rights is they want their beneficiaries to have the right to the services they can provide, but they also mean that they want NGOs to have the right of access to the humanitarian space in order to provide those services. It was that understanding that really lay at the heart of the conviction of many, many humanitarians after Somalia, Bosnia, and Rwanda, that this idea that you have a divide between politics and humanitarianism, can't do it. It's really not worth it. It's impossible to maintain. So there's this growing consensus that military force is now necessary, and it's this notion that encouraged the thinking of aid workers in the autumn of 2001 after 9/11, when they, I would say 90–95%, cheered the U.S. military intervention in Afghanistan. They had seen the Taliban up close. They had seen how useless it was. In fact, they had become Taliban's accomplices by delivering aid in the usual form, sort of supporting a derelict system. They had had enough, and they were very happy with U.S. military intervention, with a couple of exceptions. Doctors Without Borders, the French original branch, didn't go along with this, and a couple of others. But really most signed on to the notion now of state humanitarianism, a collaboration of humanitarian workers, soldiers, and government officials, and that becomes what sets up the 2000s. 5 more minutes. You're going to give me 5 more minutes, because we have to do the 2000s, or the noughts, as I'm told we're supposed to call them, right? The noughts. You know what I mean by this, right? The 2000s, the first decade of the new millennium. Here, post-Kosovo, we have Sierra Leone, Liberia, Darfur, Ivory Coast, and Congo. If we had 2 more hours, I could do all of that. Sierra Leone gets the biggest headlines in this expose book that makes me queasy to recommend it, but I do recommend it. A Dutch journalist, Linda Polman. It's called The Crisis Caravan. It just came out, I think, earlier this year in English translation. Polman, is a very cynical observer, journalist, who's been for 2 decades or decade and a half going to all of these war zones and humanitarian spaces. She tracks the explosion in the 2000s of small new NGOs, which she calls, cute name, Mongos, my own NGO. You know, 6 people get together, hey, let's form an NGO. She warns about, she's got great anecdotes here, the lack of regulation. Just about any freelancer can set up shop as a humanitarian. The horror stories she tells, and as you know, people in the medical profession, this book is written for you. You'll see what went on in Sierra Leone. Amputations is a form of terror, right? You read about this. Tens of thousands dead, maimed, or wounded, half the population displaced. But as creepy as some of the anecdotes that she tells, vacationing American doctors turn up, sponsored by their churches back home, and they perform life-threatening, sometimes life-taking surgery, often without proper aftercare, really horrific stuff. And it's anecdotal. The footnotes are few and far between, but no one who's read her book, they've attacked it for being a little bit too loose with the facts, but no one has really challenged her general thesis here about the danger of these unregulated Mongos. How many exist? We don't know. The phenomenon first came to our attention in 2004 when the tsunami hit. And if you Googled tsunami donation in January 2005, you came up with 60,000 hits, Mongo websites. I'm not saying there were 60,000 Mongos, but many, many, many. And there's concern there about insufficient regulation. Now, the danger of books like Pullman's and The Road to Hell and the others is that they sort of engage in aid worker bashing. And they lose track of, look, aid workers are no worse than any other profession. You know, I mean, I think the medical profession might be worse, right? I mean, there are journalists. I mean, there are bad apples, right, everywhere you look. So that's not what it should be about. But there's a danger there. You start reading Pullman, and you get the sense that these people are corrupted. Really, the best criticism from them has to do with the structural, the political position that relief agencies often find themselves in. And I'm just going to stop there because I know you're busy people and take questions. By the way, do you know that the greatest humanitarian of all time, certainly of the 20th century, has 4 buildings at Stanford named after him? We're not leaving until somebody guesses this. Oh, boy. Nobody? Herbert Hoover. Yes, exactly. Herbert Hoover, who really, what's interesting to me, I wrote a book about Herbert Hoover and American relief to a Soviet famine in 1921. And what's very interesting, this is Linda Pullman's book. This also, you can come up and see me afterwards if you like, A Bed for the Night. David Reef, an American journalist, very, very tough book. They go back and say, let us tell you about the history of humanitarian relief. Herbert Hoover, he gets one little mention in David Reef, who botches several facts in his discussion. Herbert Hoover, World War I and post-World War I, was the great humanitarian of his era. Of course, that got obscured after he became president and the Great Depression happened, and people didn't want to hear about Herbert Hoover as the great humanitarian. But anyway, questions about any of this or comments? Before I came in, 2 of you were talking about Rwanda. Does any of this resonate in any way? Yeah? I mean, does it sound legit? It does. Okay. No challenges. Very much so. Okay. Yes, sir.
I guess I thank you first for a very thorough look at everything from the 60s to today with regards to all the different famines. And I know that recently, I mean, not just recently, but I mean, the whole issue of famine and whether it's more government created versus, as you pointed out, a real potentially natural phenomenon has really been looked at. And it seems like the vast majority of people agree that it's more government related. I guess, you know, I wanted to touch base on the whole issue of aid bashing versus confronting governments of countries where there are famines. Recently, I know within the last 2 weeks regarding Biafra, Malaysia just refused the highest prize, the Nobel Prize winner in literature just refused the largest government prize essentially for literature based on the fact that he felt the Nigerian government was complicit in the famine in Biafra.
Back in '68.
No, just recently.
Recent.
2 weeks he just refused that.
No. I mean, but the famine he's talking about is '68.
I guess looking at like different areas right now, there's been obviously concern with the sunshine policy in South Korea regarding North Korea also. I guess my question is, it seems that certainly we can blame the Mongos and the NGOs for going in and potentially potentiating and exacerbating and lengthening famine and war and issues like that. It seems like there's less concern for the governments themselves, be it the Derg in Ethiopia or Somalia's warring factions, or North Korea itself, and with regards to confronting those governments and pushing more for replacement or removal of those governments. I was just curious as to this whole issue of blame and who should get the blame more so for exacerbations of these conflicts?
Well, let's take, we could spend an hour on it, but let's just take the Horn of Africa. You brought up Somalia. The worst drought in 60 years. 13 million people affected. Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, right? Now, if you read certain accounts, the reason that we're not getting enough aid through, we expect tens of thousands of deaths. The reason that we're not getting enough aid through has to do with politics. There is an Al-Qaeda branch in southeastern Somalia, has recently been kicked out of Mogadishu, called the Shabab. And because of that, because of their activity, there are none of the major relief agencies operating in Somalia proper. They're operating out of Kenya, right? So that's a negative. But first of all, the famine or the problem is much larger than simply Somalia. The Shabab don't control nearly all of Somalia. And the criticism is, and here's where development aid comes in, this thing has been brewing for 20 years. In other words, we can see these things coming now, years in advance. And what we need is more preventive medicine, right, than catastrophic medicine at the wrong time by waiting too long. So the Shabab is a problem. But there are ways to get around that. Sending cash by cell phone is becoming the wave of the future, right? You can get past the Shabab's militias by doing so. But the tension here is we have to focus on the right thing. If we focus on the political dimension and how that's keeping us out, what we're ignoring is that there is compassion fatigue out there. And especially since 2008, the economic downturn, people are focused on their own domestic stuff. You know, what we should have is a more sustained development effort in that part of the world. And instead, what they're waiting for, and the quotes that you read from aid agency people anonymously, is if we start to get the Biafra or Ethiopia style stick figure children, that the biblical images, right, of starvation, that's when people will respond. A guy in the New York Times said it's a problem of optics, right? If that comes across on the TV screen, then two things. It's not just donations from individuals. Only Doctors Without Borders French branch has a considerable 50% of their money comes from private individual donations. Most everybody else gets it from governments. Governments would be forced to act if those images came across on the TV screen. But the long-term, you know, undramatic, unheroic development aid is being cut. It's a hard sell on Capitol Hill and in other capitals, especially European capitals these days. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but there's so many dimensions to the problem. You know, it's hard to know where to come in. Yes.
Just kind of piggybacking on what Amish was saying. I mean, is there any kind of movement to commit these NGOs to a certain code of ethics, whose responsibility to protect, blow the whistle, and so on?
First of all, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. There are some people who would like to go back to, you know, the Red Cross style NGO. You can't do it. Just the fact that they get most of their money from rich governments means that they can't be independent in the way the Red Cross has to be by law, right? So you can't go back. You can't do that. What they would like is more quality control. Go to those websites that Nicholas Kristof in the Sunday Times recommended that you go to give a nice holiday gift. And at the bottom, go to the bottom of each of the websites, and you'll see these emblems like Good Housekeeping seals, right? And you click on those. Those are organizations that have been set up in the last 10 years. They are, like Good Housekeeping will say, yes, the money you send to these people will go where they say it's going. That's important. But the kind of policing that people like David Reef lament is no longer in place, and not just David Reef, but most people, is, say, Congo. There's a new report, just came out, on the enormous war in Congo that began in the late 90s and went up until a few years ago and took 3.5 or more million lives. that report sort of casts blame in various directions, but the NGOs are airbrushed out of it. In fact, they play a role in this, right? Darfur, again, the humanitarian alibi. The West doesn't have to go in if the humanitarian aid workers go in. And then once they get in there, they say, well, we can't use military force because we'll jeopardize the humanitarian aid workers. That's the humanitarian alibi. What people like David Reef and others would like to see is accountability. It's a business. It's an industry. And we tend to sort of automatically defer to these people like they're some part of some religion or cult or something that can't be touched. No, they have biases. They have institutional consideration. They're always raising money. What we need to do is scrutinize without aid worker bashing. I think that's the sort of the direction people want to go. One more question, maybe? Yeah, you got to go. I can tell those pages are burning, right? Okay, thank you all, folks. I can show you books if you want to come up. And I hope to come back and talk about Herbert Hoover sometime. Thank you. Thank you.